Hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar on open research for social sciences and humanities. Thank you for joining us today. Today our presenter is Katherine Burton, who is specialised in development for humanities and social sciences portfolio here at Routledge Taylor & Francis. Kath's main area of focus is to discover new opportunities for digital, open and public humanities using human-centred design techniques, and she is deeply embedded within research and practice communities. She co-leads the Publishing and Public Humanities Working Group. So Kath will be presenting for about 20 minutes or so, and then there'll be an opportunity for any questions you have at the end. So I'll hand it over to Kath.
Thank you, Caroline, and hello to everybody. Thank you for the invite and thank you for tuning in today. Just because of the setup I have here, I am going to turn my camera off whilst presenting, just because it makes it a little bit easier for me, and I hope a little bit more enjoyable for you. But I'll turn it back on again once we get to the Q&A session. So I am actually standing in for my colleague, who is the head of our open research division at Routledge Taylor & Francis, that is Matthew Cannon. But I'm delighted to be here and to welcome you to this webinar today. And we're going to dig into a little bit about how open research benefits social sciences and humanities. At Routledge, we have seen significant growth in open access articles across the humanities and social sciences, which is largely down to the read and publish arrangements with institutions and consortia, whereby authors from those institutions can publish their research openly with no direct fee to them. So whilst these arrangements have been a real game changer for humanities and social science research, making much more of the work that you're doing more openly available, and particularly here in the UK in collaboration with some of our biggest partners like GISC, that has seen a doubling in the open access output for HSS in just 1 year. What we're really trying to look at now is the concept of open research and move the conversation a little bit beyond that open access business model dynamic. However, that open access business model dynamic has put humanities and social science subject areas on a level playing field to a certain degree, especially where there's higher funded areas in science, technology and medicine. We're particularly pleased to see that some of the highest numbers of articles and some of our big arrangements are in the humanities in particular. History is a strong dynamic, quickly followed by physical science, geography and education. So these are all areas that would typically struggle to secure funding and publish more openly. Some of the things that we've also been trying to do to push forward that conversation about open research is the launch of Routledge Open Research, which is something that we launched earlier this year. And this is a new open research publishing platform specifically for the arts and humanities and social sciences. And it will combine both articles, books, and later in the year, some other research outputs such as data notes, software tools, policy brief, case studies, and more. The platform uses the F1000 publishing model and technology of rapid publication, followed by open invited peer review. And it's something we're really excited to launch to HSS communities worldwide this year. And we hope to learn a little bit more about some of those features today. So that's some of our context. It's great to be speaking to you all about open research and how open research principles and practices might become a little bit more of a regular part of your research and also part of your publishing as we move towards a more open research and publishing landscape. So when I can eventually move the slides on, what I am going to cover today is a quick overview of open research and touch on some definitions. Then going on to describe a little bit of a model of research and outline how that model might incorporate more open research practices for social sciences and humanities researchers specifically. Then talk a little bit more about data sharing, perhaps digging into what might count as data in humanities and social sciences, and outline some of the cross-publisher initiatives that Routledge is involved in and how that ties in with the Routledge Open Research platform that I just mentioned. Then going to finish up by talking a little bit more about how open research methods can increase credit and recognition for your work, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So first, I just want to talk about some of the language and themes of open research. When I think about open research, I really feel that the main aims are around increasing the transparency of research, and also that it's produced in a more open and a more opened up research process. The aim really here is to underscore the point about transparency and reproducibility. And those aims really align with the national funding and higher education agendas, and perhaps the spirit of openness to share knowledge openly and as possible, and in support of the creation of new knowledge. I'm aware, however, that some of the words that get used in an open access and open research context might not fit so well in humanities and social sciences. Specifically, that word reproducibility might be a little challenging. It's not necessarily a theme that can be applied universally, perhaps having its roots in the sciences and technology and medicine areas. But if we think about reproducibility perhaps more as a form of knowledge exchange and how to increase the impact and trust of research, then this might be something of a term that we can work with in humanities and social science disciplines. And perhaps additionally, if we shift the narrative a little to think about how parts of the research process might be shared and reused, we can perhaps also start to imagine reproducibility in ways that are more in tune with the way that research is conducted in the humanities and social sciences. That being said, I don't want to get too hung up on definitions today, but I do want to make the point that open research is often used to describe how the conversation is moving beyond that model of open access publication, specifically thinking about how the entire research lifecycle can be opened up. By being more transparent perhaps about how your research was produced and how your findings were gathered, we can perhaps support future research and perhaps move the conversation about openness forward, especially for HSS communities where it can, but not always as we have just noted, be more of a challenge to participate in open access publication with that final research product. So ultimately, open research doesn't depend on whether the final version of your research is available to read or not, but just as I noted, those deals are starting to increase. But increasingly additionally, there are options for researchers to make social science and humanities research products much more accessible to a wider audience. Open research tools and practices that make the process of HSS research more visible and more transparent for all, which is what I'm going to dig into next. So I want to go into a bit more detail about what I was just talking about and provide a bit of an example. And here on screen, we have a very, very simplified research process outlining steps in a somewhat typical research cycle. Hopefully this looks somewhat familiar to you. And I'm making the point also that obviously not all research happens like this. There are multiple steps in the process in between these different points in the circle. Doubtless messy toing and froing to contend with as ideas develop, methodologies are adopted, partners engaged and information gathered. But the point here is that once you've gathered your information and are analysing findings, it leads you to some results and some conclusions along the way. And then it's those conclusions, once they've reached their fullness, that are written up as a journal paper or as a book or a book chapter perhaps. And when we're thinking about open access, it's really that chapter or book or article that we're talking about. That open access dominant model that we know of is about making that final version of the research available for people to read. But the point here is that I want to raise that once a research question has been defined, moving on to plan out an investigation or an experiment or some of the research activities to dig into that initial idea, this produces new outputs, or potentially data in its myriad forms. I'll talk a little bit more about research data in the next few slides, but first, somewhat in connection to this research cycle, I want to talk about a model of open research that has been created by a group called Foster Open Science, funded from the European Union, which you may be familiar with. So as you can see here in the Foster model, there are 4 main pillars that are included. And I've slightly amended it for our purposes today, specifically to use corresponding terms of open science, research and scholarship. For the purposes of the presentation today, these are all interchangeable terms, but what they do is serve to distinguish open research from open access, as we've just been describing it in that dominant open access APC's business model. So what you're looking at on screen here, the first pillar, is about data sharing. Data sharing is one of the key pillars of open research and best practices that's been emerging over the last few years, and that data is a significant part of this model. So this is a kind of gold standard, something that's being strived for. It's not always fully achievable, but it's certainly being strived for across humanities and social science communities. But it really means that ideally, the data that you're producing during your research project, those ideas, those findings that you're first coming to, should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, or fair. And depending on the topic of research and the data, and some of these may be easier to find than others, will help you to gather a little bit more of an understanding about what data means in the context of open research. The second pillar is about code. I know increasingly that researchers are using code in parts of or as to actually conduct their projects. This can be used to analyse increasingly complex data sets, and in some subject areas creating computer codes, as I just mentioned, as an output of research, especially in the digital humanities, where researchers are increasingly combining humanistic inquiry with computational skills to interrogate ideas and produce new forms of knowledge. The third pillar in this model is around papers. So this is kind of where the availability of research comes in. This doesn't always mean open in quite the same way as, say, an article in one of our hybrid journals is made open through a payment of an APC, but somewhat earlier in the process, where an option to share preprints and early versions of research might be a possibility, for instance. And there are certain areas of the social sciences, and to an extent in the humanities, where sharing early versions or preprints is much more encouraged. I'm thinking here about some initiatives in political science and anthropology, where preprint repositories exist for the early sharing of articles. And the fourth pillar in this framework focuses on peer review. And whilst the majority of social science and humanities journals still make use of the more traditional peer review models of single or double anonymised peer review, there is a bit of a shift and an increase in discussion around the benefits and practices of open peer review. That's still quite a big topic, and I'm not going to get into too much of the detail about that today, but I will go on to describe a bit more about some of the definitions of open peer review as we see them, and some concepts that will hopefully be useful if you've ever been confused about that topic. So that gives you a bit of an outline of the four pillars of open research as illustrated by the Foster Open Science model, and where there might be some overlap with the research that you're conducting, and if not, how you might start to think about where open research practices might intersect with the work you're creating as humanities and social science researchers. And just before we move on from this slide, I'd just like to introduce an element of open research that may be of interest to some of you, especially if anyone in the audience is working on groundbreaking areas of inquiry where it's important to register the first findings. This is called registered reports. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on through the presentation today. But just briefly, registered reports is a relatively new article type that was created by the Centre of Open Science, primarily supporting psychology disciplines. The idea of registered reports is that the research process is broken up into two parts, and the peer review process also into two parts. This is so that first findings can be registered prior to the final article being written and accepted for publication. And there's potentially an additional benefit in that the use of registered reports might reduce unethical publication practices, as both stages of the publication, first the registration of the research and then its writer, are subject to peer review. Registered reports can be published in journals and are starting to gain some traction. I'll just leave that thought there to percolate and come back to registered reports later in the presentation. Now I'm going to dig into that perhaps more universal theme of open research, which is open data. When people start talking about data, I know that this is something that I used to think about first as an English literature student, but in other subject areas too, I started to think automatically of really well-constructed information. Maybe some spreadsheets of numbers and data that's very structured and looks like a spreadsheet type format. But for the purposes of our discussion today and what we're thinking a little bit more about and talking a lot more about at Routledge, that definition is much more aligned with many of the voices in the HSS research world, where data is meaning a much more wider range of materials, such as images, photographs, video, music, survey responses, and anything emerging from the research project. That definition that you can see on screen there states that it's the recorded information necessary to support or validate research projects' observations. It's the material that supports the output of that project. As more and more research communities engage with the open distribution of research data, we're starting to see more initiatives emerge about the sharing of data. So FAIR, as you can see in the top right-hand corner that I mentioned earlier, a findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable practice. It's not a standard per se, but a set of principles. Again, like the open science principles that aim to optimize the reuse of research data emerging across all subjects, and doing that in a way that's ethical and in line with the guidelines for the use of digital assets. There's still a lot of work to do here to support researchers in being confident in making data fair. And certainly it's not a case that all of the data needs to be openly available, but certainly used in a way that can be subscribed to by the FAIR principles. We recognise that there are some challenges for researchers using qualitative data and other data sources in the humanities. For instance, where researchers have been sharing things that they are less comfortable about sharing. When we move into other areas, especially in medicine and engineering, there are still some concerns around protecting sensitive data, medical records, or anything that involves human or animal subjects, which is something that's common across some of the HSS subject disciplines that we're thinking about. So there's some commonality there in using something like the FAIR principles to understand a little bit more about how you can and when you should share your data. So we think FAIR is a great set of principles to consider, but we're also seeing emerge other principles such as CARE, which cover the use and reuse and general governance of Indigenous data. If you're working with Indigenous knowledge creators, makers and keepers, CARE is a wonderful complement to the FAIR principles and a great example of how open research values are fundamentally linked to any open research practices. Moving on from principles, I want to give a quick summary of data activities that Routledge, Taylor and Francis have been doing. We've launched our suite of data sharing policies in 2018. And you can see on the screen that there's a kind of bigger picture on the slide there. You have data sharing policy with 5 levels, and each journal is entitled to pick a particular policy that best meets the needs of their communities. This could be a basic policy, which just gives authors a general encouragement to share their data, but shows specific requirements to do anything up to the share upon request. What authors need to do, and in consideration of the data availability statement as a section in a manuscript, is perhaps describe how that data might be made available to readers, even if that's just the contact details as one of the authors, so that data can be shared. We've been doing lots and lots of work to talk with researchers about these policies and discuss with our editors to find the right policy for each journal within this framework. And this has been quite successful. We now have over 2,000 of our journals on the data sharing policy. Some other of the activities that we've been involved in working with include other stakeholders, including the STM Publishing Association, which is the industry body for journal publishers. We kicked off a project in 2020 to convene a subgroup of the data research year that STM started in 2020, specifically looking at data sharing in the humanities and the terminology that's used and the support that's needed for researchers to be more confident and understand the expectations of sharing data in that way. Some of you have maybe seen recently that we shared a survey asking for researchers' input on how they feel, what would be good terminology to use around sharing materials or sources, and their experience of sharing data as well. To date, we'll be looking to share the outputs and more information from that survey later in the year. But more broadly speaking, I want to highlight some of the work that we have been doing with our colleagues at F1000. Rebecca Grant is our Head of Data and Software Publishing at F1000. I mentioned F1000 and the new collaborative projects that we've been working on that I touched on just now, and certainly in relation to the STM subgroup looking at data in the humanities. So whereas that group has been looking at different data sources that researchers use, and you can really see here the variety of things that count as data or humanities researchers, from the perspective of humanities researchers being shown on screen. They include various things from banks to ephemera, from music concerts to digitized newspapers. Rebecca's written about these in the blog that you can see on screen here, and you can also read a little bit more about our project in the STM link as well. We can share some of these links afterwards as well. But the thing we're trying to do within this project is understand a little bit more about researcher needs when it comes to sharing data, and to talk about data in perhaps a more universal way, to think about those research findings, research items that emerge from across the wide range of humanities and social science research projects. And this has led us to develop some specific guidance, specifically the Open Data and Accessible Source Materials Guidelines that have recently been released as part of the Routledge Open Research Platform. Here on this slide, though, I want to touch at some of those examples of data availability statements that I just mentioned. And they're specifically aimed at highlighting the availability and accessibility of humanities datasets. We're starting to introduce these to our journals as an additional option for authors to clarify the sources of any data associated with the research article. So first, you can see here how you might give guidance in the data availability statement for stored data in a physical location, to how text is being defined, and how third-party data sets are being used as data in support of the research being published. These data availability statements provide another set of references in the paper that describe the work being done, that isn't always immediately obvious to anyone reading the paper. It's early days and we're starting to see how widely data availability statements are adopted, but it's another initiative to support wider engagement with open data practices in formal publication in journals and books. So, moving on from data in journals for a little bit, we haven't just been thinking about journals in our work around data sharing. And in 2021, roughly around this time last year, Taylor and Francis introduced a data sharing policy for our books programme. This is still quite a light touch policy, and you can see in the italicized text on screen here that we're strongly encouraging book and chapter authors to share and make their data open, obviously where there are no restrictions. And again, to promote the ethical use of data in protecting human subjects. We also encourage data to be cited and authors to include data availability statements within the chapters of their research. So what you're seeing on screen in relation to book publication is very similar to the journal's basic policy that we have. We're encouraging authors to think about data sharing that currently doesn't require them to do much or anything at all. But I think it's good to start asking this question of authors, regardless of whether they're writing book chapters or journal articles, and encouraging authors to consider their research practices and how they might be able to be more open, especially around some of the information that's emerging from their project or their data. So that kind of sums up the first pillar of that open science set of principles that I showed at the beginning. Now going to move on to the second. So here thinking a little bit more about the availability of code and materials and methods. I know that obviously in humanities and social science research outputs, there's a huge range and the outputs can be highly varied. I think I showed some examples of that just a minute ago. But increasingly researchers are using more technology and different ways to capture or analyse data that they might be storing. It might be useful to highlight the ideas around using methods and protocols in the context of open research. You may think this is very much something that is particular to another discipline, but increasingly social science researchers are considering writing or using these specific tools and thinking about sharing them more openly to provide that extra transparency or reproducibility. I think it's also interesting to consider how humanities and social science research methods will create different kinds of materials and outputs, very different to what we might see in other disciplines. And that there's a huge amount of value in exploring some of those processes and methods, which can be really useful. And there'll be benefits to authors and sharing those ideas to a wider audience in a much more open way. One example might be around survey questions. So not just showing the data which emerged from the answers to the survey, but the questions that themselves have been used to generate those answers. Code also might be created specifically for the analysis of survey data. But here we're talking about materials that can be shared around as openly as possible during the project. Understanding that there might be some limitations if you're working on a large data set of survey responses, for instance, where you don't want to identify any of your participants. But perhaps sharing the questions themselves would support transparency and open research, and also start to engage in a much more broader conversation about the topic of inquiry itself. So just one last point before we move on from this slide. The logo in the top right is a badge that you may see on some articles and across journals that have been that have been provided by the Centre for Open Science. These are open science badges that have been adopted by those journals. The badges can be a useful shorthand for understanding if the journal has adopted open research practices, for instance. The open materials badge is, and I quote, earned by making publicly available the components of the research methodology needed to reproduce the reported procedure and analysis. They're an interesting way to start to think a little bit more about how we can understand how open research practices and principles are being incorporated into publications. So going on to the third pillar and talking a little bit more about the availability of research outputs as contained in early versions of articles. I talked a little bit about it, but there are two main kinds of open access, if you like. I'm not going to dwell on these too much. Hopefully the descriptions of green and gold are somewhat familiar, but very briefly, gold in either fully open or hybrid journals, and green is much more focused around archiving and hosting. The Routledge, Taylor and Francis policy around preprints and what can be shared is what you can see on screen now, and states that authors can share their original manuscript as much as they like, including on social media or different networks. And this will not count and will not be considered duplicate publication and would not jeopardise consideration for application in any Taylor and Francis journal that's allowed. So if you do share a preprint, you're still entitled to submit your article for consideration at a journal, whether that's publishing on an OA or subscription basis. So finally, the fourth pillar that I was going to talk about is around open peer review. Perhaps the most important thing to say here is that most journals are still very much using their single or double anonymised peer review process. And if you don't know what that means, this is about the anonymity that reviewers and authors hold when reviewing manuscripts for publication in a journal. So double anonymous is where neither the author or the reviewer knows who each other's identity is. And the idea here around opening up that peer review process is to reduce the idea here is to remove or reduce any kind of bias in that review process. And the single anonymised is where the reviewers know who the author is, but the authors don't know who the reviewers are. So there's still quite a lot to be dug into in terms of what open peer review means exactly. In 2017, Tony Hellower did a study where he published a paper and he had found over 120 different definitions of workflows that could ultimately be considered as open peer review. He then started to distill down the different facets of these different workflows and ended up with 7 main themes that you can see on screen. 7 main themes that you can use to make open or open up the peer review process in some way. So firstly, you could think about opening up the identities so that the authors and the reviewers know who each other is. That could be one way in the process is opened up. You can open up reports so the reviews that were written to critique a piece of research could also be made available. Or you could have open participation, where you don't necessarily invite reviewers, but anybody can go and comment on an article that's been shared in some way. And then there's a further point around open interaction, where you, the authors and reviewers, enter into a discussion or dialogue to complete the review process in a more public way. So it's not just the options on the screen that I think are important for us to think about when defining open peer review. But if you start to think that you might want to have a peer review process that had open identities and open reports, or open reports and open participation, you can quickly work out how building out the possible combinations of these ideas could lead to quite a lot of changes in the workflow. Still, that would ultimately be considered as open peer review, but it's also a way in which those open principles that we built about earlier can start to build up into a slightly different area of the research workflow. So returning to that last point in the model was the idea that I introduced around registered reports. So registered reports are breaking up that research process to increase the transparency and also perhaps to reduce waste in the research process. On the slide, you can see the workflow that's similar to the process that is followed for registered reports right now, where you can see that where you can see where the idea of designing a study has been introduced, collecting the data is then a secondary part, and writing the report is usually used for most journals. Peer review is happening after the report is written and before it's published. Here in the registered reports workflow, we're breaking up that peer review and also the research activity into 2 more distinct parts. So a researcher would identify the idea and the design of the study, but at that point, be sending those sections of the proposal to a journal for peer review. These proposals could be peer reviewed in the normal way, or they could get rejected. They could also be asked to revise the report. Ultimately, authors submitting a registered report will get an acceptance in principle. And once you have that acceptance in principle, you can go off and conduct the research, collect data, and write up the report. One of the key things about registered reports is that once researchers have that acceptance in principle, regardless of what their results say, whether they meet their hypothesis or not, and as long as they carried out the method as they outlined in the original submission, except for some principle, they can go ahead and publish in the journal. So we think this is a really interesting way to introduce the concept of publication of negative results into journals, and also it increases the transparency because the acceptance in principle can be shared in a repository. So pre-registering the activity that's going to happen in advance. And as you can see, this really focuses the research question and shifts the focus onto the research questions being answered away from the results that were first reported. I think this is a potentially really powerful workflow, and it originated in psychology, as I said, to kind of tackle a period where researchers were perhaps acting in a less ethical way. And the idea that it was trying to overcome was to remove some of the risk and the temptation to do various different unethical practices. And some of the things that Taylor and Francis offer around registered reports, some of the things that we're offering around registered reports are the option of including this article type, and we've introduced that to about 40 of our journals. So this is a really live option if researchers want to try and work in this way. We have venues that consent to do that. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about registered reports, which might be a little bit of a diversion from the workflow that we saw at the beginning of the presentation. I'm going to come back to touch on that research workflow again. This is how I introduced the concept of open research. I've already discussed how it's kind of the availability of this final version of the narrative discussion, what happened in the research, that's very much the focus of the open access publication. But when we start to think about open research, I've showed here that it can be about opening up the data, it can be opening up methods or code, it can also be about pre-registering research using the registered reports workflow. But what I really want to touch on here is that this workflow really shows how the themes of open research are much broader than open access, and are very focused on opening up the research lifecycle to give extra transparency, to try and increase the trust in the research that's being done, and ultimately the impact that may be derived from research. So moving away from open research principles now, I just want to talk a little bit more about Routledge Open Research. As I mentioned in the introduction, Routledge Open Research is a collaboration between F1000, Taylor and Francis. F1000 is the open research platform that joined Taylor and Francis Group in 2020. It really has a gold standard of publication workflow, which incorporates the number of open research themes that I've talked about today and being applied to Routledge journals. So this is the first publishing platform that's really focusing on publishing humanities and social science research with those top level of open research principles. We've also written a specific set of open data and accessible source material guidelines to help guide humanities and social science authors through the process of publishing on this platform. So there's an open data mandate for publishing on the platform. All of your data has to be open or at least accessible. And we're calling these open data and accessible source material guidelines specifically because we hope that will be a clearer way to indicate what we want researchers to engage with. And we're really interested in getting feedback on this new platform and the guidelines that we produce to guide authors in this way, hoping that will overcome some of the challenges around describing those research outputs as data and thinking more about those as accessible source materials. Another feature of the Routledge Open Research platform that we're launching later this year is something called Open Plus Books. And this is how we're going to be using the functionality of the F1000 platform and the Routledge Open Research part of that to publish book content. And you can see that workflow on screen in that bottom right-hand square. But the idea here is, and I'll just touch briefly on this, is that the Routledge or Books editorial contact will still go out and contract books and chapters in the usual way. But when it comes to submitting those, and this is step 2 in the chapter authors workflow, is that authors will submit these to the F1000 editorial team to complete a basic set of checks to ensure all that the policies and guidelines have been adhered to. But then, shortly after, probably within a couple of weeks, we'll be publishing that chapter online. So the F1000 Open Plus Books model has an open data policy. You would have that early version of the chapter and the data set associated with it available online as a publication roughly within 2 weeks. And at that point, it has the potential to begin to open up an entirely new peer review process. And this is where reviewers are invited and their reports and their names will be published alongside the chapter and visible to readers. So they can, as a reader, you'll be able to see the chapters and who reviewed it and their review reports. Once the reviews are received, the author will then have the option to revise that chapter and put together any new version that's created, say alongside the first version. So you have a very transparent versioned publication process where you have a chapter, the review reports, and then a new version of the chapter on top of that. and the process can continue and continue. Once all the chapters of the book are complete, it can then be sent off for printing as required. The chapters will remain on the F1000 platform and stand alone as chapters after this whole process. So we think this is a really exciting initiative again, and we know that lots of social sciences and humanities researchers publishing books as well as journals are really looking for a way in which they can be more open with their research process. We're really looking forward to launching this initiative later this year, but for now you can find a little bit more about what we're doing on the f1000.com platform. So finally, moving into our last section, thinking a little bit more about the benefits for researchers, and also starting to think about how open research practices might be more widely adopted. One of the things that we've been doing is trying to provide recognition and reward for authors who try and share more of their research process in our journals. So we have a range of journals that offer the open science badges that I mentioned earlier in the codes and methods section. And there are also 3 other badges that are available. One is for sharing data, one is for sharing materials and code, and other items, and the other is for pre-registration for journals that offer that option. Researchers who submit an article will have the option to fill out a form to claim the badge to be included on their research. Editors will check that all the required information is open and available for readers, and then if that's approved, when the article is published online, 2 or 3 of these badges could be included within the article, along with a short summary on Taylor and Francis online. So this as an author gives you extra visibility for actually doing the work involved in sharing material about your research or study. Also, from a reader's perspective, it should make it really easy to understand that if you're searching for a piece of research, you can see which studies have an open data set attached to it, and that this may well affect how you use work in your own research. So, in summary, we've talked today about open research practices, increasing transparency of research and opening up that process to foster more impact and potential trust. That enhanced sharing, the use and reuse of research really can also contribute to the impact of research being done. And opening up more of the research cycle gives humanities and social science researchers that option to share much more of the products of their research and try and create new knowledge and think about ways in which the work that they're doing can be reused by a broader audience. And hopefully, as publishers, we're providing more recognition for researchers through some of those open research principles and practices that we've just been describing, and integrating things like open science badges into our platform, and thinking also about ways in which we can support researchers in a broader understanding of open research practices, such as data sharing, and thinking about what that means specifically for humanities and social science research communities. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for following along and listening. I appreciate that this has been quite a tour around any number of issues and practices associated with open research, and some of the initiatives that we've been working on at Routledge, Taylor and Francis. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them now.
Thanks, Kath. Yes, as Kath said, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question box or use your raise your hand button. So I think we have one to start with, which would be, what would be your best advice regarding open research for a kind of a new researcher or an inexperienced researcher?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a number of things to consider, and it's certainly not going to be the case that everything that is produced out of a research project is something that you want to share, or that even can be shared. But I think the best advice to sort of really think about is whether if you're creating some data that can be shared, you've already gone through all of that consideration, you've maybe worked through with your research board about what can and can't be shared out of your project, and think about what the best venue to do that might be, and open up a little bit of your research in the first instance, and think about how that then might start to engage with a broader audience. So I think there's sometimes a bit of an anxiety or a challenge in opening up everything that's produced at any point in the research cycle, but maybe it's just sharing a small amount of the data that you've created, or a small amount of the first findings, thinking about the open platform that you want to use to share that information. From there, you can start to engage with a much broader audience and think about getting some feedback, asking some questions about that data, and thinking about doing that in a way that helps your research along. and thinking about how that feedback that you're getting from the community perhaps also contributes to a broader understanding and an unpacking of the research problem that you're trying to dig into as part of your project. So I think it's that concept of sharing a little of what you can on the right platform.
Great, thank you. And then the next question is, what about kind of use of like personal data, maybe like sensitive data, which researchers are not meant to keep after they've finished their research? What do they do then?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some things to be thinking about as you're going through that research design. I mentioned working with your research board or your ethics and research board to think a little bit about how your research is going to be conducted. And I would imagine ordinarily in that context, you would be thinking very specifically about any of the more sensitive subjects and the information that you're gathering from a wide variety of contexts that you would want to make sure is done in an ethical way. So I think if you're limited in any way and you're not able to share any of that information, then you can't share it. But I think one of the things about the data availability statements perhaps is that you can articulate that and you can say, well, actually we've got this data set, only part of it can be opened up because there's some sensitivity around the ownership or the content within it, and that's something that we can only do in part now. But if you're interested in learning more about what we've been finding through the course of our study, then here's a way to contact us and find out a little bit more. So I think there's some real thoughtfulness that needs to go into the design of the research, thinking about how you want to make that information open as possible and where you're able to do that, specifically if you're working with third parties. I think if you are going to open up that research beyond the end of the project, thinking again about how you're storing that information is really crucial. You want somewhere where that information is going to be safe, so that you can use it yourself. It can potentially be used by others in an authorized way. And there are lots of platforms that exist for the sharing of data and information related to various research projects that do that for you, that add some validation. They'll provide you with a DOI so things can be cited. I think those are the kind of things to be mindful of as you're going through your open research work.
Great, thank you. I don't think we have any other questions. So thank you so much for your time today, Kath, and thank you everybody who's joined us. We will circulate the recording afterwards. I'm sure if you've got any questions that come to mind after the webinar, if you reach out to Kath or to myself, and we'll get an answer for you. So thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you everyone. Bye bye.